All right, everybody, welcome to our opening night of our Fall Earth Day Everyday series. I'm Michelle Backus with Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Middlesex and Union Counties. And if you didn't already know, Rutgers Cooperative Extension is the outreach arm of the university, and we are a partnership between the counties that we serve and the university, and every county has an extension office. So if you're coming to us from Salem County, you have an extension office. And if you're coming to us from Sussex County, you have a Rutgers Cooperative Extension office also. I will be hosting the webinar this evening. As you know, the theme for this fall's webinar is the winds of change, environmental impacts from an altered climate. And with this series, we continue our very successful partnership with the Marine Extension Program Seminar Series led by our coworker, Doug Zemeckis. And as we continue to examine our environment's response to climate change and what we can all be doing to mitigate these issues. So just some housekeeping things. You are all muted. Please stay muted. Please send me your questions in the chat. You can use that chat tool at the bottom of the screen to enter any of your questions. Also, I just wanted to clarify one thing on the confirmation email that you may have received. Please note that these webinars are not all on Tuesday evenings. The days of the week vary. So please just check the dates for each webinar to see the day of the week that the webinar is on. It's also on the Environmental Stewards or Earth Day Everyday website. Okay, Julie, if you could just advance the slide to the consent slide. Okay, thank you. So towards the end of this presentation, a poll will pop up on your screen asking you to fill out a survey for this webinar. And as part of that, we are required to tell you that Rutgers considers you all to be research subjects for which we need your consent. And if you have any questions as to your rights as research subjects, you can contact the Rutgers Internal Review Board. And next slide after that. Okay. And also, we are required to tell you that Rutgers Cooperative Extension is an equal opportunity program provider and employer. Okay, so without further ado, I am so thrilled to be able to introduce you to Dr. Julie Lockwood, who is our speaker this evening. She is the director of the Rutgers Climate and Energy Institute, and she's been a faculty member at Rutgers since 2004. Dr. Lockwood is a global leader in the study of invasive species and the negative economic, ecological, and social impacts that they can impose. And today, she's going to be talking to you about invasive species and climate change and conservation. And I will turn it over to you, Julie.
Okay, thank you. Am I good in terms of sight and sound?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, great. Thanks. So welcome to this. I hope this is an interesting presentation for you. And I'm going to cover a couple main things. And since I'm sort of kicking off the theme, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the mechanism of climate change and then what that means in broad strokes for New Jersey. And then I'm going to shift to thinking about our natural ecosystems. That includes the response of invasive species to climate change, to mention a couple cases of the response of native species to climate change. And then I'm going to end on, I think, actions that are well within our grasp in everyday life in terms of helping forests and all the critters that live in forests survive and do well in New Jersey as we move into a future altered climate. So that's kind of where we're going. Oops. Okay, so the big picture here is just to perhaps for most people review what the greenhouse effect is. And I always start when I explain this to my students that you should be very thankful that there is a greenhouse effect on Earth, because that's the only thing that makes the Earth not a cold, dead planet that's rotating around some small star in the universe. So without that atmosphere, there would be no heat that's kind of kept close to the Earth. So there is a natural greenhouse effect that is responsible for the fact that we have life on Earth. And just to review how that goes, when the sun's radiation sort of hits the Earth, a good bit of that radiation, it bounces off the atmosphere. And just as a reminder, the atmosphere is just a mix, basically, of a lot of different elements, mostly being nitrogen, oxygen, but also several others. So when it comes in, when the sunlight comes in, it's sort of a shortwave radiation form of the sun's rays in terms of energy. A lot of that just bounces right off the atmosphere and stays in space, but some of it does go through the atmosphere. And when that shortwave radiation hits the Earth's surface, be that either land or the ocean, it tends to heat those places up, those sort of masses up. And when those things heat, then they will re-radiate some of the sun's energy as long wave radiation or heat radiation or heat energy. And that heat energy, some of that heat energy will also just sort of bounce back and go back up into space again. But some of it is captured by what we call the greenhouse gases, which are not nitrogen and oxygen. So even though those are the most common elements in our atmosphere, those are not greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases that are around, and then again, these are natural, is carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor for the most part. And so these, just because of their molecular structure, they tend to capture that long wave heat radiation. They don't let it go out into space, and then they re-radiate that heat in scattered directions. So I always talk about it, it's like having a down comforter on your bed, right? So all that down kind of captures your body heat and keeps you nice and cozy and warm. And those greenhouse gases do the same for us on Earth by keeping some of the sun's radiation as it turns into heat radiation right next close to the surface of the Earth, keeps us nice and warm. So we depend on a greenhouse effect in general to sort of to make the Earth livable, and the greenhouse effect is something that we rely on and is a natural piece of the Earth system. The things that are changing is that the amount of these greenhouse gases, in particular CO2, but also methane, that have been moved from their fossil form, basically oil, gas, and other things that are buried deep within the Earth, and then burned for fossil fuels, deposits a lot of that old carbon from a long, long time ago, laid down from ecosystems millions of years ago, into today's climate. And that increase in CO2, which you can see here, most of that through fossil fuels, some of that CO2 that goes into the Earth, into the atmosphere over the last several decades, half a century or century, also comes from the loss of forests, because forests do a good job of holding on to carbon until they die, and then all that carbon that's in a tree will go back into the atmosphere. So there's a lot of that that's gotten deposited into our atmosphere right now. Some of our natural ecosystems, like forests and ocean, will absorb some of that extra CO2, but they can only go so far. So what the ultimate result is that we have a lot more CO2 in our atmosphere. And since that CO2 is just a natural greenhouse gas, then having a lot more of that in our atmosphere means that we're holding a lot more heat from the sun next to the Earth's surface. So we just basically went from having like a nice lightweight down comforter to a heavy duty down comforter that's holding a lot more heat next to the Earth's surface. So the result of that, of course, is that the Earth is warming. And this is a graphic that was produced by a really cool data set and a guy who does a good job at this at NASA, I believe. So I'm going to decode this a little bit and then I'll run it. So what you're going to see is this is going to be annual temperatures of the Earth's surface averaged out for the whole Earth, starting in 1880 and going to 2024. So the zero line on here is a long-term average. Usually that average is taken of all average Earth temperatures between 1950 and about 1980. And then anything that's below that average will show up kind of in the negative part, and anything that's above that average will be out to that positive one. And of course, you see all the years, all the months of the year in there as well. So you're going to see this circling around. And most of these are going to be around zero, and that's by design because we set that kind of baseline to be sort of pre-climate change average, right? So I'll kind of get that going. And so what you see is just month to month average temperature averaged across the entire Earth, moving through all the years, where 0 is perfectly average. And then as you see the blue stuff, that's a little colder than average, and anything that's red is hotter than that average. So starting about the late 1990s and then going all the way through the 2000s, what you see is everything's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. So this is the funnel that you get out of that. And sort of nicely, you can see it kind of stacked, the data stacked up from 1880 to 2024, where the 0 bars going down are that average, and then the +1 is the hot. And so you can see how much hotter the Earth has gotten on the whole over the last really 20 years. So we've been depositing, of course, CO2 into the atmosphere for quite a long time, certainly through the Industrial Revolution, but it seems that we kind of hit a tipping point around the late 1990s, early 2000s, where we start to see the Earth's temperature start to really go up. So one of the themes that I kind of want to drive home is that, you know, the Earth is a changing ecosystem. In ecology, one of the things that we say is that that idea of a balance of nature was a little optimistic, that that ecology is all about change, that things are changing through time constantly. And certainly when you dig way back into Earth's history, you see that that change is the norm and not unusual. So this is the average global temperature taken from a lot of different records. So this is a composite of a lot of different information sketched out. This was produced by the Smithsonian. And there's a couple of pieces here. One is that, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the rise that I just showed you in that funnel is this thing on the very end, the little blip up. And you can see that we are right now kind of, in terms of the Earth's history, kind of in a cold part, right? So the Earth has been much warmer than it is now on average. And of course, when it's very warm, there are no polar ice caps. And we exist in a world right now where there are polar ice caps. And so we are existing in a relatively cool phase in the Earth through millions of years. So I think one of the things that, like when you hear the really bleak forecasts for what climate change is going to do, is like, oh, life on Earth is going to get wiped out. So I think that's an exaggeration. So there has been life on Earth for this entire span. So even though it was very hot a long time ago, there was still living things moving around. They weren't the same living things that are moving around now, that's for sure. And they weren't always in the same places. So for example, 50 million years ago, we had crocodiles on Greenland, and this is a little cartoon of that, but it's true. We did have crocodiles on Greenland. So there, I would say life always finds a way, to sort of quote from Jurassic Park. And that's been true through all of Earth's history, no matter how much the global temperature has been shifting. Now, and once you think about the greenhouse effect, then you know that when you have really hot times, you should also correspondingly see that's times of Earth's history where there's a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. And in general, that's very true. So this is a reconstruction from a lot of different sources of data, again, of the Earth's CO2, the atmosphere, the CO2 in the atmosphere going way back in time. There's 4 panels here that kind of blow up time. So the oldest one on the far left is measured in millions and hundreds of millions of years. The next one over is giving you a sense of changes over tens of millions of years. The next one over to the right is showing you thousands of years or hundreds of years. And then finally, the one on the far left is giving you kind of hundreds of years or decades. So don't be fooled by those axes of time. They're sort of pulling all this data together to kind of give you a sense of the dynamics composition of the Earth's atmosphere, which matches pretty well what I just showed you in terms of how hot the Earth was at any given time. The 2 things on this slide that I want to point out, though, is on the very, very far right, you see these RCPs. And these are modeled future scenarios that are produced by the world's leading model experts and then submitted through the International Panel on Climate Change. So these are some agreed upon emission scenarios into the future. And those are the corresponding CO2 levels that we would expect given, for example, 8.5, the one that goes really far up is sort of a business as usual model. So if we keep doing what we're doing now, kind of nonstop for the next 100, 200 years, we would expect the Earth's CO2 concentration to go up, not unprecedentedly high, right? But things that we haven't seen in maybe 200 to 400 million years. you could expect then obviously that the average temperature is going to go quite high as well. The one that kind of the gray one you can hardly see that kind of goes up and then goes down is the most optimistic. And that's basically that we get our act together and we do something about emissions and carbon dioxide emissions and also pulling them out of the atmosphere, what we put in already. And in that case, we hope that we come down from a peak that's coming in the future, but we can bring it back down to where CO2 levels are, at least at about now, not rolling back the clock a little. I'd say the most likely ones are the ones in the middle, RCP 6 and 4.5. Those are where we kind of get our act together versions. That seems to be where we're headed. That seems to be kind of what we see in terms of the world's efforts to reduce carbon. And so those are going to go relatively high in terms of the carbon that's in the atmosphere. And then you'll see a correspondingly high Earth's temperature, but not quite as high as business as usual for the next 100 years. So there's two key things here is that, remember that the graph on the far right is the time that we're showing here is in maybe decades and hundreds of years. And so you can see that if you look all the way back on the left, that there have been big swings in the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere, but those big swings happened over hundreds of millions of years or tens of millions of years. We're looking at it over a couple of decades. So although you can kind of take some comfort in the fact that life has been on Earth and doing just fine, thank you, through, a lot of different Earth temperatures, there's never been a time where we have increased temperatures as fast as we're doing it right now. So that does not necessarily give time for life to evolve and sort of respond to that change that could happen so quickly that maybe is a little worse than we would hope looking back through Earth's history. And the second is that if you look at, 1,000 years ago, then we're talking about sort of the development of modern civilizations. And certainly what we've done in the Industrial Revolution and where we put all our cities, et cetera, have been on a very steady climate, right? So the other thing to think of is that the Earth may have had warmer times with higher CO2, but we weren't around to see those, right? So the impacts in terms of what it means for us is living beings living in this ecosystems and on this planet are really very different. No one's really, there have been humans for quite a long time, our close relatives, but most of our current civilization has been developed under a relatively cold and steady climate. So this is one of my other favorite graphs to show my students, so I figured I'd share it with you guys as well. This is just the same idea where that zero line is an average by year, and then we see a distribution. So on any given day, for example, or any given year, there's some places that are hot. So that's kind of the hot colors on the right. And then there are some places that are a little bit colder, which is the cold part on the left. But most places are in that average. It's just a standard bell curve with the two tails of that distribution on the left and the right. What that means is that on, an average day on October, whatever today is, 8th, going back through time, that there's an average temperature, but every once in a while you get a really hot day, and every once in a while you got a really cold day. And that's represented in those tails of the distribution. And what we would consider hot and cold doesn't change. Keep that in mind. So we might say, just for reference, let's just say that any day that hits that 2 point is going to feel like a really hot day to us. So I'm going to set this in motion and you're going to see this distribution shift. So my point being here is that as that average shifts, so does that distribution. This is called the climate jellyfish by some people because it bounces around like that. But you can kind of see these are taken from a ton of NASA and other temperature readings across the Earth's surface. So I really want you to start to see the top of that bell curve shift over to the right for me, and that's that shifting average going up. But what you really see is the number of really hot days become way more common. So when we say extreme events, that's what we're talking about. You can have a change in average, but it means also that what we would consider extreme event become far more common than they used to. So if we pull this down to New Jersey, I'll just give you a couple of slides on this, is that the average annual temperature in New Jersey has increased by 4 degrees since 1985. We actually are increasing a little bit faster than the global average for reasons that are interesting, but I won't go into in a lot of detail. So we are getting hotter. You kind of see this also in kind of the average summer temperatures. What are the hottest summers in New Jersey over the last, what's the top 10 hottest summers and across all the New Jersey state climatologist records, which go back quite a long ways. And almost all of them are post 1999. So again, we're seeing this as sort of an example of maybe those averages and even those extremes, meaning that we're getting hotter and hotter every year in New Jersey. In terms of ecosystems and how non-human animals survive, I think the more important kind of statistics that come out of looking at how climate is changing is these three graphs. So the one on the left is January and December temperatures. So that's our winter temperatures. And our winter temperatures are getting milder and milder and milder every year. So you see that tick up again, starting around late 1990s. Almost all the graphs, you see that shift around the late 1990s where things are getting hotter, but they're getting hotter in interesting ways. And one of them is that our winters are warming far faster than our summers. So if you grew up in New Jersey in the 1980s or the 1990s, then you experienced a winter that's really quite different from your kids and grandkids. They're not experiencing very cold winters. Another piece of that is that our nights are getting a lot warmer than they used to. So the nights are warming faster than daytime temperatures. So you kind of see this again, starting in the late 1990s and 2000s, those bars go up. And that means that our sort of warm nights, anything that's above 70 that we would consider warm nights, are becoming far more frequent. And then finally, we start to see spring conditions show up or arrive, if you will, sooner and sooner every year. So the greener on the graph on the far right here is sort of the earlier the leaf out is for trees relative to a baseline, again, usually around 1950 to 1980. So the greener it is, the sooner spring is coming in as measured by when the leaves break buds and start to grow. So New Jersey is in some of the greener parts of that. So our spring is sort of arriving sooner and sooner every year. I think we've sped up the arrival of spring by at least 2 weeks at this point. So from an ecological point of view, to me, these are the changes that really matter, right? Because these are the sort of things that decide and set a species niche, right, or its niche, in terms of what kind of conditions do they need to be able to survive and complete their annual cycle, or to not survive, especially in terms of invasive species, and not stay in New Jersey, or maybe they're here for a little while, but they would normally die out in the cold of the winter, but they're not doing that anymore. So these are big changes that have ecological impacts. Another thing that has a lot of ecological impacts is what happens when we heat up the atmosphere is we really juice up the water cycle. It becomes far more intensified. And the way you measure that for us is we don't, our big sort of hydrological shift is in heavy precipitation. So this is data from NOAA, and it's showing and this is for the Northeast in general, is how much more common are big precipitation events, either 2 inches above average, 3 inches, I'm not above average, 2 inches of rain, 4 inches, 5 inches, etc. And the little bubbles with the numbers tell you the percent increase from 1958 to 2018. That's the data that we have here. So they're all increasing, but the big one that's increased by over 100% is days with 5+ inches of precipitation. So these big rain events. And they also, I'd say, you can look at the variation is changing a lot as well. So we're getting like most of our precipitation is coming in these big rain events. Then we'll have periods of no rain at all with a lot of kind of droughty conditions. So when this rain comes, how much comes, how much time in between matters for us, but it also really matters for the ecosystems that we live in. So think about a tree, what a tree needs, or insects and birds and things like that. So it really is an important piece of how we define how a species niche and where it can live and where it can't live. So in total then, what effect does this have on our ecosystems, especially in New Jersey? So I'm going to kind of move into that piece. So one of the outcomes is that species are responding. Like if they're niche conditions, how much rain they need, how drought tolerant are they, how cold tolerant are they? if their food itself is moving, if the trees and things that they nest in, are they shifting their distribution, is that they all shift with the climate. So this is just showing that in a lot of cases, a lot of the species that were native to our area, as it gets warmer, then they are forced, in a sense, to move north because that's where the conditions in which they can live have shifted as the world has warmed up. So thinking about the crocodile on Greenland, right, that's a pretty big shift from where they are now, but at that hot time, they could live up there. And in this case, because we're going from a cold period into a warmer one, then you can see that things are just starting to shift north. Some of this particular one is produced by Audubon, and it's a model of where they think ruffed grouse its range will shift, both its winter range and its summer range. So we see a lot of examples of this, and we expect a lot more of these shifts north. So this is just one species. This one, you know, in New Jersey, you would see it. If you go to North Jersey in the winter, you can see a ruffed grouse. But these days, it's very rare to see a ruffed grouse in the north of New Jersey, and in another 10 years, you're unlikely to see them again, certainly anytime soon. So keep this in mind because I'm going to show you another sort of more composite thing of how ranges shift. And so this is an example, like a good visualization of what happens when climate changes and the conditions in which a species can live will move. And the species will move along with those conditions. They'll just track them. And in this case, it usually always goes north. We see the same thing in terms of our forests. So, you know, if you're into forests at all, we tend to categorize them as like oak hickory forests or maple, birch, and beech forests or shortleaf pine forests. And this is just a map and then a modeling exercise of saying, okay, what are our forests going to look like in the Northeast as it warms? And as these trees encounter changes to their niche requirements, you know, what kind of drought and rain can they live through and what kind of heat can they live through, et cetera. And what we see, the one on the far left has a nice mosaic. The Northeast is a fantastically diverse area in terms of trees, forest trees. And you can see that because it's all modeled in different colors, and each of those colors represents a different type of forest. Going from spruce fir forests up in Maine, and our little nice pine barrens, which is the loblolly and shortleaf pines down in New Jersey. But most of this area is maple, birch, and beech. But we also have around here some elm, ash, and cottonwood forests. So with a low emission scenario, meaning it's going to warm up a little bit, then we start to lose that diversity, and you can see that in most of New Jersey, they expect will turn to mostly oak hickory forests. And then the dominant forest in that case will be the maple, basically a maple forest. If it heats up a lot, then what we expect in terms is that we lose almost all of that diversity in terms of forest types. The dominant forest we'll see in the Northeast are all oak hickory. And we see these little refuges, these little last pieces of the other forest types that either have probably mostly just moved north outside of the range of this map. So our pine barrens seem to be intact, maybe even a little happier, who knows, but we'll have a lot more loblolly and shortleaf pine. And most of the Northeast will be oak hickory, and then we have these remnant pieces of maple, birch, and other forest types. So you can expect, I think, that we're going to continue to see lots of changes in forest composition as the world heats up and as this rain pattern changes. In terms of invasive species, so, you know, those are our native species and they're moving. Well, all the invasive species that are already established in North America are going to respond exactly the same way, right? They have their own niches. There's nothing special about them, even though they're not native to North America. They are also going to shift with climate change. So this particular graph is of 134 invasive species, most of them plants that are already established somewhere in the US. And the black dots represent the sort of centroid of their geographic range right now. And then the gray is where they're projected to be, I think is 100 years in the future with 2+ degrees of warming. So that mid-range warming scenario, we kind of mostly get it together scenario. And so the directionality, I want you to pay attention to the red arrows in particular. So that's the directionality. Where are they going to move to? They're all moving north, but a lot of them are moving northeast, which should clue you in the point of this one. And then the length of that arrow tells you how fast they're going to be able to move or we expect them to move. So the main take home here is that there's a lot of established invasive species throughout the just east of us. I don't think they modeled anything within the coastal area because it got a little hard with the coast. But you see that we are looking to get a lot more expansion of existing invasive species into our area. So climate change will drive some of them out. Maybe there's a chance for some restoration in places where we didn't think there were, but we also should expect there's a whole lot they're going to find in the Northeast as a reasonable refuge for them, climate refuge for them into the future. So that range shift is just one way that I think climate change will alter the impacts of invasive species. This was a nice graphic that was produced recently for the journal Insects. And they do this for pest insects. And so expansion of geographic range is one of these, but I think the other ones are when you have an increasing the onset of spring, then what you do is allow a lot of these pest insects to have one more generation. So a lot of them are multi-generation. They'll have multiple breeding events throughout the entire summer, spring, summer, into the fall. So if the weather warms up enough and the temperature is right, then they will emerge early and have one more generation. What that means functionally for us is that it's just higher abundance in terms of these pest insects. Another one is when you have decreased, well, you have milder winters. So the winters are less harsh because of climate change, and there's increased overwintering survival of some of these species. So we kind of relied on the fact that our winters were harsh enough that it hacked back at some of these insect pest populations. They just never could do well here because it got cold enough in the winter that a lot of them would die off. But as those winters become milder and milder, that's no longer true. And then finally, we have to worry about the fact that we may have an insect pest that's well controlled with biocontrol, or is well controlled through their natural enemies that just birds eat them or whatever it is. But with climate change, different species respond differently. Kind of they have their own schedule and what they're responding to, and they can desynchronize in terms of when they hatch out and when they're available. So some of our natural enemies may not be exerting as much predation pressure on some of our insects because of the desynchronization caused by climate change. So moving into kind of more happy area to me is to think about what the possibilities are for restoration and conservation, especially relative to the sort of dual ability to provide ecological functions, but also reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. So the really nice thing about trees is if you want to remove atmosphere, they're a built-in little mechanism for doing that, right? Because they're big, they photosynthesize, and photosynthesis is all about pulling CO2 from the atmosphere, fixing it through photosynthesis for use within the tree, stored within the tree as the trunk of the tree, or even better in the roots and the soil around it. They're really good at CO2 removers from the atmosphere. So if we think about that and their function in that sense, then you can ask, what is the potential for forests or planting trees or conserving forests to pull some of this carbon out of the atmosphere? So this graph is a little busy, but I want to show you the stuff in blue. So the possibilities for reforestation or natural forest management, or just avoiding loss of forests or urban reforestation in terms of its ability to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, is substantial. And we need to really pay much more attention to that. The same is true for grasslands, although not as much. And in our area, I think that's mostly avoiding grassland conversion or conserving grasslands. Grasslands, you don't think about them as holding quite as much carbon, but they're still photosynthesizing and they're putting a lot of that carbon in their roots. So it's not obvious to us, but it's there, and it's there in the soil. So that brings us around to, okay, so if I want to do something about, as a steward of our local ecosystems, and what's available to me to sort of put some time into, I think one of the more interesting things is thinking about reforestation and restoration, and in particular in riparian areas, which we have a lot of around here. A lot of our riparian areas do not look good at all. If you're familiar with riparian areas at all, that picture on the left kind of makes you kind of squirm, because there's no shade for the things that are living in that water. In fact, there's not much living in that water based on the picture. There's a road that goes right over it, so it's sort of cut in half. The shorelines are not stable. But if you restore that forest and you add some riparian vegetation, you're planting trees, you're putting putting better banks in that are not going to erode, you get rid of that road, then you have a nice sort of riparian forest, and the stuff that lives in the stream will increase. All the critters in the stream are going to be a lot happier because it's a little cooler with all the shade, and you produce a lot of habitat. The key, we've been thinking about restoration for a long time, is, taking this place as degraded and pushing it back to what maybe it looked like in 1954 or whatever. You're trying to go back to what it looked like before urbanization. With climate change, you're not doing that. You're really thinking about, what do I do to future-proof this place? So if we know it's going to get hotter, then you probably want to plant more trees than what used to be there, because what you need is more shade, because the hotter it gets, the hotter that water is going to get. And hot water means that most of the things that live in the water can't survive. So if you want to build climate smart sort of futures and future riparian forests and restoration, you got to overplant the trees relative to what used to be there. So it's restoring to the future, which is a little oxymoron, but what you're doing is you're restoring to the fact that you're making that place resilient and functional and an expected climate future. Another big piece to me is a lot of North Jersey is a lot of headwater forests, meaning that those forests have a lot of headwater streams in them, where those streams come in and combine and go into either the Delaware or the Raritan rivers. With these really flashy floods and these precipitation events that we have, those headwater forests become critical, because what they do is they're big giant sponges that take up all that extra precipitation, store it locally, or don't even allow it to get into the stream, which then won't flow into the urban areas downstream. And of course, if it's a good forest with good healthy undergrowth and everything else, then it has an ecological value as well. So having either restoring or conserving those headwater streams have so many benefits in terms of climate change. Pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, cools those streams and keeping them good for salamanders and things like that, but also tends to regulate these big precipitation events that we're going to get increase. Those are not going to go away. We're going to continue to get more and more of those big precipitation events. So that's a place to really concentrate time and effort. Another part is that if a species is going to change and shift its range, it needs a way to get there, right? So it needs a pathway to get there. We call these climate corridors. And so we're linking up habitat, especially across a latitudinal gradient from south to north. So for our native species, then we're just trying to make it so that they can kind of literally move from one good habitat to another, so they can track what's a suitable habitat to them as the climate starts to change. That might be a long linear piece of forest in an agricultural or urban area. You're kind of keeping that or restoring that, such that the native critters can find their way north when climate starts to change. It could be just having enough patches of habitat to get through kind of hostile territory. It could also mean that we need to do something about all the roads. It would be nice to sort of decrease the amount of wildlife and other things that get smushed in our roads anyway. But if we think about the fact that roads serve as a crazy barrier, I mean, they're really effective barriers to movement for a lot of different native animals in our area, then they won't even go near a road, much less get smushed in the road. Is that if we can build good overpasses, nature overpasses, or culverts underneath that allow species to move. Movement, we kind of need them to move. We need to build that in. For streams, because a fish is not going to just jump up and move, 2 states north, the key is that what they tend to do is they tend to move and shift their range up in elevation. So reconnecting, taking out the dams, taking out the culverts, anything that's stopping fish movement will allow them and other in-stream organisms to shift their range up elevation without getting stuck behind a dam. And then finally, kind of bringing it a little bit more close to home, is thinking about how nature kind of helps us both in terms of pulling some of that CO2 out of the atmosphere, but also helping us deal with those, especially in our area, those flash floods and other things that are happening. So these are 2 pictures that are out of Europe. I don't know of any in the US. So compare, the one on the right looks like it's AI generated, but it's not. And the one on the right is just a building footprint from where they took a building down. And then of course there's a big hole, and they turned that into an urban wetland. And so what that does is when there's a lot of flash flood and a lot of wash from the streets. It goes into this area and just holds that water so it doesn't flood the rest of the city. And then there's a connection out to whatever river or ocean that's nearby. So when it's not flooding, it makes for a fantastic place to spend a little time outside in an urban area. Green vegetation, shade for those days when it's super, super hot, which are becoming more and more common. And of course, anything that grows in an urban area sucks up CO2. The one on the left is rethinking what we do with all our little green spaces near roads or around buildings, and moving towards native vegetation, diverse vegetation, making sure they have plenty of room for their roots to grow. There's a mix of trees, so this is just nicer in terms of living in the city, but it also works really well for allowing some of that stormwater to drain in and not go down on the streets and flood things out. And it also creates more shade for those really hot days in urban areas where it gets life-threatening. And it also pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it's like a win-win-win-win-win. So thinking about what our efforts can do to be kind of a climate smart city and what we are already experiencing, what we're going to continue to experience. And then the final piece here is just, this is a great paper for people who are interested in these things. It's a nice readable paper. It's by Bethany Bradley, who's up at UMass Amherst, and some of her crew. And I think there's a continuum here. I want to concentrate on the second one down. And those are the things that we kind of already do as environmental stewards. We sort of already know that we have landscaping that promotes native flora and fauna. That's a pretty common and cool thing to do. And it's fun to have that around so you can see the birds and insects and butterflies. We can also advocate and make sure that when we do restorations or reforestations that we're not using non-native trees. That would be a disaster. So we want to make sure that those trees are native, at least to North America. So those are things I think that are kind of obvious that we're already doing. But if we put a climate component on that, then we would take it one step further. For example, a climate smart native gardening is that we're thinking about all the species that are shifting their range sort of into our area, native species, or out of our area. And we're planting our yards not only to be an ecological landscape, but allowing the surrounding ecosystems to kind of keep up with climate change. And then the same is true with our reforestation. Are we not only not picking non-native trees to plant, but are we kind of helping make sure that either we're using genotypes that do well in warmer climates that are just south of us, or we're even thinking about planting trees that we know are going to have a little bit harder time moving on their own. So it kind of puts yet another interesting spin on what it is that we do in terms of our environmental stewardship goals. So with that, I think that's enough, and I'm really looking forward to answering some questions. So I guess the end part here is kind of what role do you think you want to play? And hopefully I kind of gave you a few ideas about what it means to think about forest restoration, in particular, urban reforestation, or any other goals that I think are well within our reach, and doing that in kind of a climate smart way. So I'll end there, and then Michelle, maybe you can help me field a bunch of questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was perfect. Perfect on the timing too. Okay, folks, so I launched the poll. If while Julia's answering questions, if you could go ahead and be filling out that poll, I would appreciate it. Okay, so a couple of questions here. One is that first of all, go ahead, folks, and put your questions in the chat to me. Thank you. One question from Kathleen: can we do anything to release some of these excess CO2 gases? Why are they accumulating excessively from the 90s versus, say, the 1970s?
So the accumulation is just a function of, well, I think we're burning more fossil fuels. That's part of it, is there's just more of us and there's more fossil fuel burning for various reasons. So we keep upticking in terms of the fossil fuel use. And so that's not helping between now and say the 1970s. But the other thing is that the heating effect is not linear, right? So it's not like with every one molecule of CO2 that gets popped up in the atmosphere, you get one change in temperature, that it takes a while for it to all build up, and then suddenly it starts to just roll. So unfortunately, what happens is, or what I mean, for example, we're kind of locked in at this point to increase temperatures because of all the CO2 we've already put into the atmosphere. It takes a while for the whole thing to respond. And then when it does respond, it kind of gets on a roll, I guess is the way to describe it. Releasing it, so you can't, you don't make or destroy carbon. It just cycles through our ecosystem. So the only way we get it out is through more plants photosynthesizing, or there's some technologies that chemically can kind of take carbon out of the atmosphere. And then when they do, the idea is that, as one of my colleagues says in Earth and Planetary Science, is you take all that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and send it right back down to the dinosaurs. So right now that works, but it's not scalable. So there's a lot of technical things associated with a technical solution of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Okay. Okay. And then there was another question. You had noted some of these species migration, some of these plant species migrations. One question came in about maple trees based on the different scenarios. The way I'm interpreting this in question is I think they're asking if they plant new maple trees, will they survive? We get this question a lot, by the way. What species should people will call the extension office and ask what species should they be planting?
Right. So that's a good question. So I would say the answer to that is still a little up in the air, in the sense of, are there versions or varieties of maple trees that are endemic, say, to just south of us, warmer conditions? So they're still native to North America. Of course, we're not picking up Japanese maples and moving them here.
Right.
But would they hang on to that ability to exist in warmer climates? And so should we be targeting those species to plant here? So there's a lot of research on that idea. And, is it true? Is that true? Does it really help? So that's, I think, the idea is that we need to be looking a little further afield in terms of our sources of the species that we plant. I don't know that I would change the species that we plant in the moment. But I would change and think more broadly about the source of where we're pulling them from. So, maybe you're buying them from a stock that's typical of Georgia, right? And you're planting them here instead of getting stock that's New Jersey stock.
Okay. Okay. So that's a great plug for planting native, but also looking at paying attention to the ecoregions that your plants are coming from, as well as, where are they sourcing their material from? That's a really great point. Something that we do try to talk to people about. Another question. So what part does adaptation of plants and animals play as the climate changes? For example, I planted a large hostel garden beneath some very large trees. And over the past 30 years, my trees have been destroyed by storms.
Yeah.
My hostel garden thrives even in full sun.
So as a question, you do interpret that as, what's the evolutionary potential for things to adapt?
I think so. They're asking, yes.
Okay.
You said yes.
Okay, so that's another great question. And we do see that some native species are evolving to, they can keep up with the kind of rapid changes in these different various niche factors, right? Be that amount of rain, drought, heat, whatever it is. But is that the norm? That's a good question. So species, if you look at sort of the long time, is that some species evolve very, very quickly, and some haven't changed in a bazillion years,
Right.
So it's just hard to know which ones are going to do really, really, they're going to be fine in terms of being able to evolve and deal with it, and some that are not. I mean, turtles have been turtles for a bazillion years, right? They don't evolve quickly. But sparrows do, right? They evolve very quickly. So,
Yeah.
we kind of, like, in terms of you have to kind of think about it as there's not a one size fits all answer there. But I will
Mhm.
say that the more we look, the more we're like, oh, cool, they are kind of evolving and kind of dealing with things at least, which is not something you would necessarily expect given how rapid everything is happening. It's very rapid, much more rapid than we've seen before.
Yeah, it also does seem like a lot of our species are fairly resilient.
Yeah, they may be, and they may be more resilient than we give them credit for, right? And so that's another area of exploration is like, well, we see them here now, but maybe, for example, that maple tree is in fact more resilient to these different changes than we would have thought.
Mhm.
Lots of experiments in ecology to really test that idea out. It's like,
Mhm.
how resilient are they in terms of their needs? And some of them are a little more resilient and some of them are not. They're just not as resilient. We thought they weren't, and they really aren't. And so being able to sort those out so that we know what do we really have to worry about, which ones do we really have to pay attention to, um, is a big goal.
Okay, well, speaking of which ones to pay attention to, another question came in from Phaedra, which was in my mind. Phaedra, thank you for asking this question. With beech leaf disease, oak wilt, emerald ash borer, along with other stressors on trees and forests, including the ones you mentioned, rain, wildflowers, storm, what is the realistic ability to increase reforesting efforts? And how successful would we need to be to make a difference? Wow, it's a lot.
I wish I had the answer to that question.
Right.
Um, you know, that's, I mean, to me, it kind of challenges a lot of the things that I would think about in terms of restoration, in the sense of, okay, what can I plant that's gonna do okay? It creates a lot of really uncomfortable questions, to be honest, and trade-offs. So I don't know that I have a great answer to that question, honestly. Um, I would, I always sort of point back to, um, if we continue to get a whole lot of different invasive species, and my expectation with increasing trade and global trade, which is one of the reasons why we get a lot of invasive species, and with climate change perhaps bringing more to our doorstep, I just don't see it getting much better. We need to be much more cognizant of the fact that we need to sort of respond to these new things soon, see if we can't kind of stop the spread or slow it down. And then we got to speed up our process of figuring out solutions to, I mean, beech leaf disease is just difficult to deal with, period, because it's not like
Mhm.
you can release a biocontrol that's going to take care of that.
Mhm.
Um, but with some of the invasive insects, it's quite possible we can kind of knock them back a little bit. You can kind of count on nature. I mean, nature's doing a pretty good job with spotted lanternfly. As soon as everything figures out they can eat them, then it's not quite plague proportions anymore. So there may be things that we can kind of move along and help ecologically to make that happen. But God, that's a tough question. I don't really know the answer to it.
Yeah, I mean, we also talk a lot about appropriate deer management in New Jersey because, as you said, nature, does have a way of dealing with these, and these native species can, help out. They can move in and compete with invasive plants but with the added issue of inappropriate deer management, overpopulation of deer, it just makes it so much harder.
I
So,
think about that a lot with those, like our forests in North Jersey and along those headwater streams and everything else. It's like you really
mhm,
need a healthy understory for them to function as a good sponge for all these big rain events, right?
yeah, yep,
So yet another reason to do better deer management.
yeah, yeah. Okay, another question from Esther. Yes, about the maples. We are planning a food forest. Should we plan for species south of central northern New Jersey? Hence the question
Maybe.
about sugar maples. How should we plan? They want to know, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends on which species you're looking at, right? Like who you want to plan for. If you're thinking about what are those forests are going to support in terms of maybe birds or reptiles and things like that, then yeah, some of them are moving north. Um, we have amphibians respond quickly and strongly to climate change, and so you can kind of take a look. It's like what are the frogs that used to be, we'd only find in Maryland and Delaware, North Carolina, that suddenly start showing up in New Jersey. Like those are the ones that you're like, oh, that's kind of curious that they're showing up now. It's like, oh no, it's not curious. It may be the future. So you kind of pay attention to those things and think about what you want to do. I think it very much depends on how, when you're restoring these forests, who do you have in mind that you're thinking about restoring them for, and over what time frame? So, and in particular, I would pay particular attention to the amphibians if you're thinking about that, because they usually do rely on these riparian wetlands or just in our area forests, period. And some of the birds. Some of the birds are also moving north or not migrating anymore because they don't have to, because it's warm in the winter.
Right, right. There's a lot of interest / controversy about assisted migration.
Yeah.
If you want to weigh in on that.
Right. So that's one term that actually everybody uses a slightly different.
Right.
So when someone says that, you got to immediately ask, what do you mean when you say assisted migration? So sometimes people mean taking stuff that's endemic maybe to the south and moving it well outside of its native range and up here where they think it's going to survive. That one's risky, because even though I know it's endemic and maybe it's not doing very well in South Georgia, it may do extra well up here.
Right.
You don't want to.
You've introduced a whole
another invasive species
right.
problem. But there are other times when people are talking about moving those genotypes. And in that case, I would say, it's assisted migration in terms of either increasing our genetic pool up here, hoping that you can kind of supercharge the adaptation, or you're just trying to make sure that you have some stock, some resiliency in the species that you're moving. So there is no one single answer here, except there's a gradient, and on one side I'm like, no, please don't do that, and the other I'm like, oh, that's a good idea, you should probably start thinking about that. So that's part of the controversy, is we keep talking past one another, each other.
Okay. All right, so this is great in terms of time. Folks, thank you so much for filling out the poll. I am going to close it soon, and this is also the time to enter in any of your last minute questions. While you're doing that, if anybody wants to put in any last questions for Julie, I just want to remind you that our Earth Day Everyday series continues. Just need to bring up the website here. So next week, we hear from our own Dr. Amy Rowe on October 15th, who's talking about food waste and climate change. And then I'll put our website in the chat so that you can see what the other ones are, what the other what the rest of the series holds. Also, did you know that you can donate to our program? This program is free to the public, but if you are looking for a place to put your money, we have a place for you right on our website, and we always welcome your support. You can donate right on our website to the program, and that goes to continue to support these types of programs. Question just came in. Well, first of all, lots of thank yous. Julie, thank you so much. This was great. Another question: can we share Julie's slides talks with our elected officials? If that's okay with you, we do put all recordings on our website, and they're available to the public. So you are welcome to share those with who you'd like to share them with. Okay. All right. And I think that's it. Thank you everyone for being here. Dr. Lockwood, thank you again for being our first speaker. And we will hopefully see everybody next week.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.